Hello and welcome to Landscape Irrigation Week 5. This week we're going to be finishing off Chapter 5, Part 2, which covers pages 41 through 46. And the topic is on selecting sprinklers and spacing ranges, and we'll be discussing precipitation rates. Chapter 5 is a large chapter, that's why we're breaking it up into several pieces. We're going to talk a little bit about how water is distributed from the sprinkler head. In this particular illustration, you see an impact sprinkler, and it has a radius of about 40 feet. And water from an impact sprinkler, or any sprinkler, has a certain amount of water that it distributes along the way within close radius of the sprinkler and further out to the extent of its sprinkler range. So in this illustration below, it shows this impact sprinkler right here has more water up close to the sprinkler head and less water as it goes out from its radius. Okay, now we're going to talk about scheduling uniformity, or SC, versus distribution uniformity low quarter, or DULQ. The scheduling coefficient is the average depth of water divided by the depth of water in the area having the least amount of water. The formula is the average depth or volume divided by the lowest depth or volume in the driest area. Whereas the distribution uniformity low quarter takes into account the average of the lowest quarter. So DULQ is the average depth or volume of the low quarter divided by the average depth or volume of all the areas. The DULQ formula is the average volume or depth of low quarter divided by the average volume or depth of all times 100. And that will end up being a percentage. So head-to-head coverage is what is recommended, but it's still not perfect. In this illustration here, you'll see that I have these sprinklers spaced at their recommended spacing, which is 15 feet at 30 psi. And even when they are spread apart perfectly in the square pattern, you can tell that there are certain areas that get hit with sprinklers more frequently than other areas. For example, this sprinkler in this lower right-hand corner is a 90-degree sprinkler, and it reaches its neighbors, which is head-to-head coverage, and they reach back to him. And you'll see that there's places within this particular zone that is hit twice or 3 times or up to 4 times with water. So even though they're spaced perfectly the way that they should be, it's still not a perfect system. Okay, here's something to consider when you're designing a system. So that straight edges are easier to predict where your dry spots are going to be, where your overspray is going to happen, and where you're probably going to have more overlap than other areas. If you end up with a crazy shaped area like this illustration on the bottom here that have a lot of curvy edges, it's really difficult to predict where the overspray and runoff is actually going to happen. So the curvier this design is, the more likely you're going to have overspray and runoff. The importance of head-to-head spacing. It's the job of the sprinkler to reach their neighboring sprinkler head. So in this illustration, we have a 90-degree pattern sprinkler here, and you can see that it is reaching its radius all the way to its closest neighbors. So this particular sprinkler's job is not just to irrigate the area right in front of itself, but also to reach its neighbors here. And then they return the favor by also having head-to-head coverage back to that sprinkler head. So where you want to space your sprinklers is at or closer than their specified radius. So in this diagram, it shows that this is a 15 by 30 area. We're using 15-foot sprinklers, so we're spacing them 15 feet apart. So you want to check the manufacturer's specifications for what the radius says the sprinkler head will do at the pressure that you have to work with. So these spray sprinklers are typically used for smaller areas that require a shorter radius than larger areas do. So this would be a smaller turf area, possibly at a residential project rather than a larger commercial large turf application. You'll see in this illustration here that 30 psi is the optimal pressure for this particular sprinkler head, and at 30 psi it will do the 15 feet that this particular sprinkler head is intended to do. The typical spacing for this nozzle would be 15 feet apart. Again, you want to check the manufacturer's specifications for its radius, and you also want to check and make sure that you're working at the right PSI. So over here we have the Hunter NP rotator, and it shows in bold that 40 PSI is the optimal pressure for this particular sprinkler head. So at 40 PSI, this sprinkler head will go 14 feet. And you'll see that that's consistent for the 90-degree pattern, the 180-degree pattern, and the 210, that at 40 psi they all go 14 feet. And then also over here on the right we have a Hunter 12-foot spray nozzle fixed pattern, and its optimal pressure is also in bold, which is 30 psi. And at 30 psi it'll go the optimal radius of 12 feet. Same for all of its patterns. Then when you get into the larger rotating sprinklers or rotors, you'll see that the optimal pressure is still in bold, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're all going to go the same radius. Because these are all various different flow rates, it doesn't have the matched precipitation in this particular rack of nozzles, so you have to pay close attention to the optimal pressure and what its radius will be. Also notice on the right hand side we have the low angle nozzles, and they have the optimal pressure of 50 psi instead of 45. So keep that in mind if you're going to be intermingling some low angle nozzles with your standard blue nozzles, that you may run into some issues with psi variance, and also that your precipitation rates may not match. So keep that in mind. So again, if you take a look at these Hunter Pro Spray fixed arc nozzles, the number nozzle that it is, number 5 nozzle, is a 5-foot radius. The 8 is an 8-foot radius. The 10 is a 10-foot radius, and so on. The other thing that you may notice is that the manufacturer model number usually has a direct correlation with the intended radius. Like I just mentioned here, where the 5 is 5 foot, the 8 is 8 foot. But also in the MP rotator series, it's not a perfect system, but once you kind of understand it, it's a little bit easier. So here the MP 1000 is from 8 to 15 feet. So if you think of that as that's about 10 feet, not 1,000 feet, but 10 feet. The MP 2000 is right around the 20-foot radius. So if you just take the first two numbers, that's the approximate radius that you're going to be working with. Like the MP 3000 is about 30 feet, and the MP 3500 is up to 35 feet. So that can kind of help you out a little bit if you come across a nozzle and you read what it says on top of it, that there's usually a correlation between the radius and the model number. Types of spacing patterns. We have the square pattern and the triangular pattern. The square pattern is usually where you have equal sides running along in 90-degree patterns next to each other so that you can have them straight across from each other. The triangular pattern is generally used where the area to be irrigated has irregular boundaries that are more open and aren't confined, or the worry of overspray or the need for part circle sprinklers are needed. You'll see the triangular pattern will be more popular in large open spaces like baseball fields, football fields, where the square pattern might be more of a residential system. The rectangular pattern is basically the same as a square pattern, but it can also be referencing an area that is square in nature but doesn't have perfectly equal sides, where this one is a square pattern, but the sides are not equal. The sliding pattern is a pattern that's basically integrating two different patterns at the same time. And that's used mainly where you don't have much of a choice for that. And in this particular illustration, it's on a ball field where they kind of go back and forth along a curve between rectangular patterns and triangular patterns to meet the needs of that particular field. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses of the different types of patterns. You can read this in your catalog as well. I'm going to just give you a synopsis of this. So basically, when you have square spacing sprinklers, they look something like this top illustration here. And eventually you end up with a little weak spot in between. And I showed an illustration a little bit ago that showed how many times each space is potentially getting hit with water. Well, this particular little space right here is only being hit potentially twice. From this sprinkler spraying in this direction and from this sprinkler spraying in that direction. And as you get further into these patterns, you'll see like this area here is being hit 4 times. It's being hit by all 4 of these sprinkler heads. So this is a little bit of a weak spot, and that if there's wind that picks up, then it's more susceptible to becoming a dry area. So when you have a square spacing, you generally have these spaced equally apart, right? Well, if you have a triangular spacing, it gets a little bit trickier as far as figuring out your spacing, but it does help to clear up that weak spot. There isn't that same particular weak spot that you have in the square pattern in the triangular pattern. So when you're doing a triangular pattern, there's a little bit different math, and we're going to go over that in a minute. So we're going to go over a little bit of the math for triangular and square pattern spacing. So like we said before, the square pattern is pretty much equal spacing, and in this illustration we show that the spacing of the sprinkler heads, or S, is at 40 feet, and the spacing of the lateral, or L, is also at 40 feet. So the triangular pattern, in order to try to avoid having that weak spot, there's a little bit of math involved of how to calculate where these sprinkler heads should be positioned. So in this case, what you're doing is you figure out your spacing. This diagonal spacing here would be your 40 feet, and then how deep this is apart, or your lateral, is this spacing of 40 feet times 0.866, and that will tell you how far apart these laterals should be right here. And in this case, 40 times 0.866 is 34.64 feet. So that's how far apart the lateral would be in the triangular spacing, versus the square spacing, it would be 40 feet. Now we're going to talk a little bit about precipitation. So precipitation is the speed at which water is applied at the rate of inches per hour. And the easiest way to try to think of it is like rainfall. If you hear that you had a rainstorm and it rained an inch overnight, that usually seems like a substantial amount in the particular region that we live in. And over here on this chart, you'll see that the precipitation rate for square spacing is somewhere around 1.5 inches per hour if you're using the optimal pressure of 30 psi. Whereas if you're using a triangular spacing, that precipitation is going to be a little bit higher because the spacing is a little bit tighter, and each nozzle is covering a smaller amount of square feet, so the amount of rain that's going to be hitting there is a little bit higher. So you'll see that triangular spacing is higher than square spacing. So here's the math that's involved in calculating these precipitation rates. We're fortunate enough that most manufacturers have these charts already handy for you. So you just need to whip open the catalog and take a look, and it's right there. So the formula for calculating the average precipitation rate for a whole area. So this is calculating precipitation rate for like an entire zone is 96.3 times the flow rate in gallons per minute divided by the area. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about 96.3. This is a constant that converts gallons per minute to inches per hour. And where it's derived from is that there's 60 minutes in an hour divided by 7.48 gallons in a cubic foot times 12 inches per foot. So instead of always having to do this math right here, 60 divided by 7.48 times 12 is about 96.3. You don't actually have to remember all that. Just remember the 96.3. So 96.3 times the flow rate divided by the area. So here's the math behind the precipitation rates. So in this particular square that I've designed here, each one of these sprinklers in the corners contributes to a portion of the flow rate of the entire area. So each one of these nozzles is putting water into this space. So here we have 4 15-foot cues, which is a quarter. This nozzle right here at its optimal pressure at 30 psi, here's the flow rates, puts out 0.93 gallons per minute. So we've got to take the number of nozzles, which is 4, multiply it by its flow rate, which is 0.93, which equals 3.72 gallons per minute for the entire area. Okay, that's part of our formula, the flow rate that goes right here on top. The other piece of the puzzle is how big is this area? Okay, well these are 15-foot quarters. We need to have head-to-head coverage, so this is 15 feet by 15 feet. So here we have 15 by 15 equals 225 square feet. So now we have everything that we need to know to be able to calculate this formula. So we take our 96.3, multiply it by our total flow rate, which was 3.72, and then we're going to divide that number by 225 square feet, which comes up to 1.59 inches per hour. Now compare that to the chart. The chart here has 1.58, and the reason why it's not exactly perfect is in this book, and a lot of designers will use the formula that's actually 96.25 instead of 96.3. 96.3 is just rounding it off. So that's why our number is super close, but not exactly perfect. So if you want to do the formulas on your own and then check your work, the catalog is a good place to do that. Okay, so now remember when we were doing triangular spacing that there was a little bit more math involved if you were going to figure out how far apart your laterals should be. So same chart, only on the right-hand side here, you see that its precipitation rate for a triangular does not have the same answer as square. Well, that's because it's fewer square feet being covered for that same flow. So in that same scenario, 15 feet times 0.866 would get us our lateral, which would be 12.99 feet. So our sprinklers would not be spaced 15 by 15. They would be spaced 15 times 12.99 or 13 feet. So then our square feet comes out to a different amount. So we still have the same flow rate, the 3.72, but our square feet is different now. So there's fewer square feet. There was 225 when we were doing it 15 by 15. Now we're doing 15 times 12.99. Comes out to this different answer. So if you do this entire formula, you're going to come up with 1.84 inches per hour. Again, it's very close, and that's just because the rounding difference. Okay, so now we're going to talk about match precipitation rate, but before we do, I want to welcome you to my pizza parlor, where my pizzas are sold by the quarter, half, or full pizza. So no matter what size you get of pizza, you pay the same price per slice. So that's a pretty good deal, right? Okay, so imagine here that you come to the pizza parlor and you buy a quarter of a pizza. That pizza costs $2.50. So then if you decide, no, I'd rather have a half a pizza, that pizza is going to cost you $5 because it's twice as big as this quarter pizza, right? So then how much should a whole pizza be? Well, if a half a pizza is $5, you should be able to figure out how much money a whole pizza is going to run you. Okay, so the price of a whole pizza was $10. Did you guess that? You probably did. Okay, so what does that have to do with match precipitation rate? Okay, hang tight. Okay, this isn't as much fun as pizza, but this should help it sink in a little bit. So notice here on this chart where it says 15Q, it's a 90-degree nozzle, is 0.93 gallons per minute. Okay, so now let's look at a half circle. A half circle is 1.85. And then let's look at a 360-degree or full circle sprinkler, and it's 3.7 gallons per minute for the entire nozzle. So notice as the number of degrees increases, so does the flow rate. This is important because we want to make sure that we have match precipitation throughout the system with various nozzles to choose from. So think of it as you want to have a system that's raining at an equal rate. You don't want to have like a really black cloud on one end of your landscape, pouring rain onto it, and then a light fluffy cloud on the other end applying water at a different rate. You want to make sure that water's landing in each space at the same rate and depth. So that's why it's important, and why I showed you the pizzas. So it's the same sort of formula. So the 90-degree pattern is going to put out about half of what the half circle is, and the half circle is going to put out about half of what the full circle is. Okay, so now we're going to do a little bit more calculating on precipitation rates. So here we have an example of the MPR nozzles being used. That's match precipitation rate. So notice the flow rate. So here we have a quarter over here that is 0.6 gallons per minute. We have a half circle, which is 1.2, which happens to be twice as much as the corner. And then we have a full circle, which is 2.4 gallons a minute, which happens to be twice as much as the half circle. Okay, so in this illustration, let's just imagine that this sprinkler system just goes on and on and on, and it's a really big system. Well, we don't want to have to add all of them up to do this work to figure out the precipitation rate. So we're just going to take a representative sample of that landscape to calculate the precipitation rate. So here we have the spacing that's 11 by 12. We know what the flow rates are. Now we just have to figure out how much water is actually landing in this particular space. So I took this chart from the catalog, and it shows here the full circle sprinkler is 0.6 gallons a minute, which is a quarter of its discharge landing in this space. So you can see this full circle is 2.4 gallons a minute, but only a percentage of that flow is landing in this particular area. Happens to be 90 degrees of it, so that's a quarter of it. So they took this flow rate of 2.4, divided it into 4, and that's where the 0.6 came from. Also, the half circle is only putting half of its water into this particular space. So this 1.2 would be divided into 2 pieces, and it's also 0.6. Then you have another half circle over here doing the same thing. And then the quarter circle sprinkler, which is the one in the corner, is putting all of its water in here. So we add up all of these numbers here. We come up with 2.4 gallons per minute is in this particular area right here. Now remember, we're only going to calculate the amount of water that's landing in the space that we're calculating it. So here down at the bottom is the precipitation rate calculation. So we have 96.3 times our flow rate divided by the area. So the area happens to be 11 by 12. So if you do all of this math, you come up with 1.75 inches per hour. Okay, and this one is from page 44 of the design manual. And this example is similar to that last one where you're only going to calculate the amount of flow that is hitting that space. So you might want to pause for a moment, read that page, come back to this, or we could just keep going. So because each sprinkler head here is a full circle, we can't calculate the entire flow of the full circle into this space. So very similar to the last one, each one of these sprinkler heads puts out 4.4 gallons per minute total, but it's spraying outside of this area that we're in. So we're only going to calculate the amount of water that's landing in this particular 40 feet by 40 foot space. So if this sprinkler head is putting out 4.4 gallons per minute and only 25% of that spray is landing inside of this square here, we're only going to count that much flow rate. So if you take 4.4 and divide it by 4 pieces, it's 1.1 gallons per minute is landing in this particular space from each one of these sprinklers. So here's where we're going to go. We're going to say 1.1 gallons per minute times 4 sprinklers equals 4.4. The 4.4 is how many gallons per minute is falling into this 40 by 40 space. So now we have everything that we need to know to be able to calculate our precipitation rate. So we have our 96.3 times 4.4 gallons per minute divided by the area, which is 40 by 40, will get you a precipitation rate of 0.2648 inches per hour. So that's just a little bit over 1/4 of an inch in an hour of equivalent rainfall will be hitting this space. This concludes Chapter 5 through page 45. Pages 46 through 52 should be done on your own, and if you'd like to do the exercise at the end of the chapter, feel free to get the extra practice. Next week, we'll be talking about Chapter 6, which is lateral layout and circuiting sprinklers into valve groups.